Welcome, YouTube, to No Rares Required, Episode 10, Orzhov 3 or Less. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today we'll be covering my strategy for drafting Orzhov, or White-Black, in Brothers' War. The archetype's theme is reanimating cards that are 3 or less from your graveyard. While you can approach the archetype this way, especially if you open a bomb that costs 3 or less, like Misery's Shadow or Siege Veteran, I've had more success going for a tempo-based flying strategy, since White has access to a bunch of cheap flyers, or going for an attrition-based strategy, since White and Black has arguably the best removal options in the set. So similar to my guide to Rakdos, I feel like you have to balance between which strategy you're going for, attrition or tempo. Interestingly, Orzhov is the second least drafted archetype, which I find surprising because I had speculated that Rakdos was overdrafted because of the good removal options, but Orzhov has good removal. It might be because White's removal comes in the form of enchantments. I don't know. But what I do know is that it has a comparable win rate to Rakdos, which is not good. And like Rakdos, I think it's because people have been torn in two directions when drafting. My top common for Orzhov is Airlift Chaplain. I've mentioned this card in every guide to White, and someone asked me if White is kind of doing the same thing in every archetype, and to an extent I have to admit yes. I can't stress enough that the set is weak to flyers, and White has the best flyers at the common level. This card also synergizes with the archetype's theme if you find yourself going in that direction. My next top tier common that I want as many as I can get is Ambush Paratrooper. If you find yourself with like 6+ removal and going for the attrition-based strategy, I still want it. Unlike other attrition-based strategies where you stall until some card gives you inevitability, I've found myself outvaluing my opponent and winning by going wide. And this card helps your unblocked 1/1s and 2/2s hit for more damage. And if you get up to 10 mana, which isn't unheard of if you're playing a really grindy control game, then being able to pump this twice can be how you win the game. My next top tier common is Overwhelming Remorse, and it works quite nicely with Airlift Chaplain, and is a synergy that I definitely want to take advantage of if I'm in Orzhov. The more creatures that you get in your graveyard, the cheaper and better this card becomes. In the tempo-based flying strategy, I hold this until my opponent plays a creature with reach or a flyer of their own. And in the attrition strategy, this is one of my many removal spells. Scrapwork Cohort is also a top tier common and is great in both strategies. In the attrition strategy, this gums up the ground and works well defensively while you amass an army that can overwhelm your opponent, and in the tempo strategy, it applies good pressure. My last top tier common is Scrapwork Mutt. I've talked about this card in almost every single one of my guides. A 2/1 for 2 that helps you smooth out your hand early is so important to not falling behind. It's a little less important in the attrition strategy compared to the tempo strategy, but I still want as many as I can get. I love this card. I don't find myself splashing very often in Orzhov, and if I do, it's not for red. So you won't usually get to unearth this guy, but it's great even if you can't. Now for my second tier commons, and this is where we start to see some cards that I want in specific strategies for Orzhov. So Aeronaut Cavalry, I really only want it in the tempo flying strategy. If you haven't been seeing Airlift Chaplains and Ambush Paratroopers, then the value of this card comes down quite a bit. It's also worth noting that Airlift Chaplain is not a soldier. But if I'm trying to win by pressuring my opponent in the air, this is a great card to include 1 or 2 of in the top end of my deck. Prison Sentence is an interesting card. As removal, you'd think that I would want as many as I can get in my attrition deck, but the fact that this leaves cards like Siege Veteran still pumping the enemy's board, it isn't the best spot removal that you have access to in Orzhov. I might still run 1 or 2, but I'd rather be running Overwhelming Remorse, for example. It's actually the tempo-based flying strategy where I want as many of these as I can grab, because all I care about is whether or not they can block my flyers, and this does a great job at removing a blocker. Moment of Defiance is a card that I think you want to take advantage of if you are in black. It is very undervalued, and it will wheel all of the time. I think you only want one or two when you could easily pick up 3 or 4, but this card is so great if you find yourself racing the opponent in the tempo strategy, and if you need some life gain to stabilize in the attrition deck. My last top tier common is Combat Courier, and I really only want it in the attrition-based strategy. Using this to chump and then draw a card is really nice. And again, I don't find myself splashing in Orzhov, so you probably won't be able to unearth it, but 3 mana to stop an attacker for a turn, draw a card, and add to the body count for Overwhelming Remorse are all great for the attrition strategy. I'd like to end my comments on the commons by mentioning a couple of traps. I have not been impressed with Recommission or Emergency Weld unless you find yourself with a cheap bomb, like I mentioned earlier. I'd much rather focus on more removal for the attrition strategy in the form of Disenchant, Disfigure, Gix's Caress, or some late game stabilization like Boulder Branch Golem. I think the Graveyard Recursion strategy is best achieved in Dimir, and even there it can be difficult to set up without falling behind. I think those 2 recursion strategy cards are the reason why that Orzhov has a lower win rate than I think it should. Recruitment Officer is my top tier uncommon and a card that I want for both strategies. It can help you dig late and applies good early pressure as a 2/1 for 1. And in Orzhov, I'll even take it over my favorite white card of the set, Static Net, my MVP of no rares required. It works well in both strategies and just gives you so much value. It's the best removal at the uncommon level, so it works great in the attrition strategy, and it removes any non-land permanent so it can get rid of something that blocks a flyer. It also gains 2 life, and it creates a Power Stone. I will play as many of these as I can. Next up, we have the one card I recommend splashing for in Orzhov, Skyfish Spider. I also want as many of these as I can get in both strategies. This card works nicely with cards like Scrapwork Cohort, where you can sacrifice the little 1/1 token, but hitting a Mutt or Scrapwork Courier can always be a decent backup plan. It's great removal because it can target any non-land permanent, and the reach has been really nice in stopping my opponent's flyers. I like it a little bit more in the attrition strategy, but they tend to get picked up pretty early, so I'll take as many as I can get. Ashnod's Harvester is probably the true MVP of no rares required. It is a tier 1 or tier 2 uncommon in every single archetype, and in Orzhov it is definitely tier 1. It's great pressure for the tempo-based strategy and a decent blocker for the attrition. I cannot stress enough how valuable it is to remove a pesky unearthed creature or a creature that they plan to reanimate with this card. Combat Thresher is also a card I'll take as many of as I can get. For the tempo strategy, you're going to play this out for its prototype cost, and in the attrition strategy, you most likely will as well. But if you top deck this super late, a 3/3 double strike that is card neutral is amazing late game. Another uncommon that I've found that works well for both strategies is Mishra's Research Desk. It can help you dig for even more removal in attrition or a late game threat, and in the tempo strategy it helps find additional flyers when you've emptied your hand. Now for my tier 2 uncommons. Hero of the Dunes is a tricky card because you'd think that it was best in the late game attrition deck, but its best archetype is as a splash in Azorius. Bringing back a flyer, and more importantly giving +1/+0 to your cheap flyers, is where this card really shines. It also works wonders with the unearthed artifacts like that cost 3 or less, like Mishra's Research Desk, Scrapwork Mutt, Combat Courier, etc. It's still decent in the attrition deck, but really only if you have a bomb that costs 3 or less. My last uncommon worth mentioning is Yotian Frontliner. I really only want to be playing this in the tempo deck, as it applies a little bit of early pressure and then can be used later to give a flyer +1/+1 to push more damage through in the air. And one of the things I'd like to say is don't be afraid to attack this into your opponent's defenses if you can get the damage through in the air. I've been in many a game where my opponent just sits back and attacks with just their flyers instead of using this card to get additional damage through. Now for the rares. My top tier, absolutely busted rare is Siege Veteran. It costs 3 or less, so this is the kind of card that will tempt me into the attrition strategy if I can find the removal, because bringing this card back after they find an answer can just win you the game. It also works great in the tempo strategy, makes your flyers bigger, and it gives you a 1/1 if they use their removal on Ambush Paratrooper instead of Siege Veteran for some strange reason. Another 3-cost rare that performs very well is Loran of the Third Path. It performs the best in Orzhov of any of the other archetypes. It fits the attrition strategy, being quasi-removal, and since it costs 3 or less, you can bring it back for even more value. I wanted a little less in the tempo-based strategy because it doesn't fly, but the card draw can be nice, although risky, to find additional answers if your opponent has stopped your attack in the air. You may notice a trend here. Another 3 or less cost rare. Misery Shadow performs quite well in Orzhov and is another reason to actually try the archetype's theme of bringing back cards that cost 3 or less from your graveyard. It's great in both strategies, since this can usually attack every turn as long as you have the mana to threaten to pump this up to destroy whatever blocks it. As I've done in the past, I'm going to skip some rares that are great to include but generally stronger in other archetypes. Gix's Command performs better in every other black archetype, since Orzhov I tend to be mostly white. It's best in the attrition strategy if you do end up being able to play it. And Steel Seraph is great, but it performs best in an archetype where you can have more Power Stone synergy, like Celestia. And Precursor Golem is great, especially if you can hit it with a Moment of Defiance, but it performs best in Gruul, where you have Power Stone synergies, as well as the ability to protect it with Gaia's Gift. Transmigrant's Crown, on the other hand, performs the best in Orzhov. I mentioned it in my earlier guides to Boros and Azorius for a reason. This is great to equip for additional damage in the air from your cheap white flyers, and in Orzhov you can pay the discounted equipment cost. If I open up Transmigrant's Crown, I look for ways to be in Orzhov. Now for some more brief mentions. Simeon's Simulacrum is good to include, but is better with Power Stones, and when you can afford its unearth cost, like you can in Gruul. Gixian Puppeteer can work nicely, especially if you have a 3 or less cost bomb to reanimate, but I still find it best in Rakdos. The Mightstone and Weakstone works great in any deck with late-game mana sinks, like Ambush Paratrooper, but it's better in decks with Power Stone synergies like Gruul and Simic. Liberator Urza's Battlethopter is worth a mention. It performs slightly better in Azorius, but it fits perfectly into the flying tempo strategy and is definitely worth including in your Orzhov deck. And hey, look, it's also a rare that costs 3 or less. Now for the Mythics. Wormcoil Engine is busted, and Orzhov is no exception. It works really well in the attrition strategy as a card to stall to, but if you've played the set as much as I have, then you know this card goes in every deck. Cityscape Leveler is great if you can play it. I prefer it in Simic because of its expensive cost, but it can be a good card to stall to in the attrition strategy. Myril, Shield of Argive, works well in Orzhov as well, as long as you're going for the white-based tempo strategy. I'd say she's better in Azorius, but she's actually quite comparable in Orzhov. In the Trenches is best in Orzhov and Azorius. Pumping all of your creatures and then pumping them again with Ambush Paratrooper can overwhelm your opponent, especially if you have gone wide with Scrapwork Cohort and such. Phyrexian Fleshgorger is great in both the tempo strategy and the attrition strategy of Orzhov. The lifelink is great when it comes to racing your opponent, and the menace helps you go wide. And in the attrition deck, slamming this down as a 7/5 lifelinker feels especially great. Platoon Dispenser is also worth a mention. It's better in Celestia, where you can take advantage of Power Stones while also going wide, but it is still a great inclusion in Orzhov. My last mythic is Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. The late game mana sink ability works well in the attrition strategy, but getting to draw a card off of your evasive white flyers is really the reason why I think Gix performs the best in Orzhov of all of the archetypes. It's also a great mythic to close out my guides to Brothers War, and welcome our Phyrexian overlords in All Will Be One, coming to Magic the Gathering Arena next week. I'm so excited. Thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Orzhov, and thank you for enjoying my guides to Brothers War. Please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Brothers War has been a very enjoyable set, and I look forward to rewatching these guides myself when I need to dust off the cobwebs, because I will definitely be looking to play more Brothers War when they rotate it back in on Arena. Next week, I will be presenting my first impressions of All Will Be One, going over the set's mechanics, what each color is attempting to accomplish, and my top picks for commons and uncommons. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.